Hello, I'm Alice Baxter with BBC World News. Our top stories. Freed Russian billionaire Mikhail Khodorkovsky says he will not re-enter politics. He's due to give a news conference in Berlin. Scuffles between police and protesters in Bangkok as Thailand's opposition stages another mass anti-government rally.
The aim of this, the latest in a whole series of protests, was to show that after so many weeks, they can still bring out impressive numbers of people onto the streets of Bangkok.
The UN Secretary-General demands an end to the conflict. And as Cuba's President Raul Castro calls for civilized relations with the US, are we about to see an end to more than 50 years of hostilities? And a very warm welcome to you. Russian billionaire Mikhail Khodorkovsky says he will not re-enter politics or seek assets from his former oil company Yukos now that he's been released from prison. He was freed on Friday after spending more than 10 years in jail following a pardon from the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Well, he's about to start speaking at a press conference in Berlin, and this is the live scene from that room. Of course, we will bring you the news conference as soon as he starts to speak. We are, of course, waiting to hear from Mikhail Khodorkovsky, formerly Russia's richest man, who's spent the past 10 years inside a Russian penal colony in Siberia, released on Friday on pardon from President Vladimir Putin.
Please squeeze this way.
Well, while we wait for that press conference to get going, let's bring you some other news now. Anti-government protesters in Thailand have marched to the Prime Minister's home as part of rallies being held across the capital, Bangkok. The protesters want the Prime Minister, Yingluck Shinawatra, to step down. The BBC's Jonathan Head has the latest from Bangkok. Jonathan Head there for us in Bangkok. Let's go back to our top story now, to Berlin. This is the live scene inside the room where we're waiting for the former jailed Russian tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky to enter the stage. He has, of course, been freed. He was freed on Friday after 10 years inside a Siberian prison. We are awaiting him to begin talking any moment now, and the recent scrum of press activity led us to believe that he was about to step onto the stage. But before we managed to hear from Mikhail Khodorkovsky, let's go and speak to our correspondent in Berlin, Steve Evans. He's also standing by for Khodorkovsky to take to the stage. Steve, what do we think he's going to say?
We don't know. He's certainly been saying this morning that he's not going to get directly involved in politics in Russia, and that he's not going to go back to try and reclaim the wealth he lost. Those scenes you're seeing there are chaotic. It has been a pretty chaotic scene all around, basically. The journalists at one stage were warned that it might be unsafe for him because there are so many there, such a crush of people. The room is clearly not big enough. It's been chosen at the Museum of Checkpoint Charlie, the crossing point between communism and capitalism during the Cold War, to be particularly symbolic. But it doesn't seem to be the right kind of room for this kind of press, I have to say.
Right, it does seem a little too small almost, doesn't it? Because, Steve, just remind us why there is such a furore of excitement surrounding the release of this man. There doesn't really seem to have been a story like his to rival it in terms of rags to riches to incarceration to freedom to potential president, but probably not. He is unique, isn't he?
Yeah. That's right. I mean, it's an amazing human story, but it's also a very big political story. He was the richest man in Russia, worth something like $15 billion, billion with a B dollars, 15 years ago. He started financing opposition groups, and coincidentally or not, he then found himself charged with tax evasion and money laundering. 10 years ago. He was arrested 10 years ago. Those charges were put. He was then jailed. and was released in the dark hours, the small hours, only on Friday. After that, 10 years in prison. So you have that human story of a massively wealthy man in those privatizations after the end of the Soviet Union. While he was in prison, his company, an oil company, was dismantled, its assets were sold, and most of them ended up in the hands of the state. So he comes out without those assets. So that's the human story. On top of that, the allegation from lots of groups, including Amnesty International, is that he was in effect a political prisoner because he'd been financing opposition groups and was such a big figure in Russia that President Putin felt threatened by him, and so those charges were politically motivated. That's the allegation. So the big question now is, has any deal been done so that he keeps silent in exile, and does he become a figurehead, an anti-Putin figurehead in exile, a kind of prince across the water? That's the big question which we hope he'll answer.
And hence the reason there is so much excitement building up in that room in Berlin at the moment. And the political intrigue surrounding Khodorkovsky that you alluded to there, Steve, that answers the surprise surrounding Putin's decision to release Khodorkovsky. Of course, it came amongst this wide-ranging amnesty for at least 20,000 prisoners from Russia that he announced very recently. But it wasn't necessarily a dead cert that Khodorkovsky was going to be released. Only 2 years ago, Putin was saying comments like, "A thief belongs in jail." There was no real hint that he had any intention to release the man.
No, absolutely not. People were certainly expecting the Pussy Riot people to be released, for example, in Siberia. And a lot of journalists headed out east for that release. Completely wrong-footed then when Mr. Khodorkovsky was released up near the Finnish border. We don't quite know what diplomacy's been going on here. Certainly a former foreign minister of Germany, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, has been involved. We know that because he met Mr. Khodorkovsky when he landed in Berlin, and he brokered this deal. So there has been this back-channel contact, certainly between influential people in Germany, whether or not with the pretty active involvement of the German government itself and Chancellor Merkel, we don't know. Certainly with her approval. But this kind of contact has been going on certainly for years, building up on contacts that were made before Mr. Khodorkovsky was imprisoned. Mr. Genscher met Mr. Khodorkovsky when he was a rich and powerful man, and he was staying in the Adlon Hotel here in Berlin. The hotel, the luxurious hotel where he's now staying.
What a change from where he's been for the last 10 years, Steve. Steve, for now, many thanks. We will, of course, take you straight back to Berlin as soon as Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the freed former Russian oil tycoon, begins to speak. Right now, though, let's catch up on a little bit more news, because fighting is continuing to spread in South Sudan. A week after the violence began, thousands of foreigners have fled the country in the last few days, and at least 500 people have been killed. While in the latest development, South Sudan's foreign minister says Sudanese troops have pushed the rebels out of the city centre of Bor, and says the country's former vice president Riek Machar has fled to avoid capture.
Now the government has sent in troops in order to move them out and assert the sovereignty of the country. Of course, Riek managed to escape. He used his boat along the Nile and ended up at his own village of Adok, and then went into Bantiu, where the night before, he attacked the government institutions in Bantiu town.
Now, at least 7 people have been injured by a freight train that derailed in a slum district of the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. It's believed scores of people are trapped under cargo wagons after the train fell sideways onto a number of homes. Some reports say a tank containing flammable fuel is leaking onto the tracks. Rescuers are trying to clear space in the crowded slum to bring rescue equipment to lift the wagons and reach those trapped. Kenyan newspaper reports say the rescue effort has been hampered by large numbers of people gathered at the scene. OK, let's take you back now to our top story and cross back to that crowded room in Berlin where the world's press is awaiting for the formerly jailed Russian oil tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky to take to the stage. We've been waiting for him to begin talking for the last 10 minutes or so. No sign of him yet, but the furore of press activity suggests that he is now on the stage and will begin to speak any moment now. Mr. Khodorkovsky, of course, released on Friday on a pardon from President Vladimir Putin. It was a part of a wide-ranging amnesty given to at least 20,000 Russian prisoners. I believe we can now listen in and hear what Mr. Khodorkovsky has to say.
It's going to need to be cleared. You're going to need to back away as best as you can, OK?
Apologies, we rather overexcited there, thinking that Mr. Khodorkovsky was about to speak. Understandably, a lot of press attention surrounding this event. A huge number of press packed into that tidy room, hence the need for a little bit of housekeeping, trying to keep things in order there. We will, of course, take you back to that scene as soon as we hear that Mr. Khodorkovsky has taken to the stage. Well, do stay with us here on BBC News because there's still a lot else to come, including English cricket's premier spin bowler Graham Swan calls an end to his illustrious career. Let's cross live now to our top story and go live to Berlin, where the freed Russian former oil tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky is about to speak to the world's press.
Any microphones that we can pass around? That problem needs to be solved, otherwise we cannot start, so please move back.
OK, a little bit of housekeeping happening just ahead of Mr. Khodorkovsky beginning to speak. He was, of course, freed on Friday after more than 10 years spent inside a Russian prison. His release was part of a general amnesty for at least 20,000 Russian prisoners from President Vladimir Putin. He's been in prison, of course, since 2003 and was due to be released next August, but then requested a pardon because his mother is suffering from cancer. And Mr. Putin then surprised Russians last week by agreeing to that pardon. But in a statement after his release on Friday, Khodorkovsky stressed that he had not admitted guilt and made reference to those who had been unjustly convicted and continue to be persecuted. He then left the penal colony where he was being held in the northwestern Russia part of Siberia, close to the Finnish border, early on Friday afternoon. We do know that he has said that he will not seek to re-enter politics and will also not seek assets from his former oil company, Yukos. But of course, we are, as is the world, awaiting to hear what Mr. Khodorkovsky has to say to himself now for this long-awaited press conference. And I believe that we can now listen in to the translation from that press conference live from Berlin. Let's have a listen in now. And we leave Berlin and Mikhail Khodorkovsky then just answering a couple of questions put to him by the BBC's Daniel Sanford there on whether or not people should go to Sochi. He replied saying it's a celebration of sport. Let's go live now to the BBC's Steve Evans, though, who's also been listening into this. Steve, what did you make of what Mikhail Khodorkovsky had to say, particularly his acknowledgement of the role played by Chancellor Angela Merkel in his release, a role which he claimed he knew nothing about until today?
That's right. He said he was freed at 2 o'clock in the morning, thinking he was going home, and he found outside the prison that actually he was going to Berlin. So he's learnt all this. The things that jumped out of that press conference were there are still political prisoners in Russia. And Western leaders, when they deal with Mr. Putin, should remember that. Also, he didn't appear to endorse the idea of a boycott of the Sochi Winter Olympic Games. So those are two pretty important things, really.
Indeed, and he also seemed very keen to not be pressed on what his future plans were. But for now, Steve Evans, many thanks. You've been watching BBC World News. Do stay with us. We've been listening to Mikhail Khodorkovsky speaking live from Berlin. Up next here on BBC World, we've got reporters. Stay with us. Well, let's go live now to our correspondent, Steve Evans, who's in Berlin and who was watching that press conference very closely for us. Steve, such a powerful figure, not just in Russia. Khodorkovsky, his first public appearance since being freed after spending 10 years in jail. How did he appear to you?
Well, he looked like a man who just spent 10 years in jail. He had that shaven head and that gaunt look of a prisoner, and you got a sense, I think, of the bewilderment of the thing. He described the way he was released, being told at 2 a.m. On Friday morning that he was going home, and then learning in the cavalcade of cars outside the prison that actually he was being taken to the airport in St. Petersburg and then flown to Berlin. So a bewildered man. You got a sense of him not quite knowing what the future will be. The struggle for politics is not for me, he said. In other words, he's not going to get directly involved in politics back in Russia. But you can't avoid the symbolism of the whole thing. He kept saying how there are still political prisoners in Russia, and Western leaders, when they meet President Putin, should remember that. So broad political statements, but also a statement that he's not going to get involved in the day-to-day politics. Also a recognition that he can't go back to Russia. Technically, he's free to do so, but he said that old charges could be reactivated against him. And one of those charges involves a claim for $550 million. If you got that kind of sum hanging over your head, you think twice before returning.
Indeed, he said he couldn't yet be sure that if he returned to Russia, he would then be allowed to leave. And one of the most interesting moments I thought out of that press conference, Steve, was when he was asked how should world leaders deal with a man like Vladimir Putin. And he paused for quite a long time, didn't he, before giving that answer?
He did. We have the upcoming Winter Olympics in Sochi. The question, certainly here in Germany, is whether it should be boycotted by leaders. He didn't recommend a boycott, though he did say that those Olympics shouldn't become a party for President Putin. So clearly no love lost between the two men, but on the other hand, he's not backing those who say stay away.
And it was an emotional press conference, wasn't it, Steve? There was lots of thanks to everyone involved in his release.
Absolutely. Thanks to Angela Merkel in particular, who's clearly played a pretty big role behind the scenes. It was a pretty bizarre spectacle, I have to say. Hundreds of journalists, maybe more than 1,000, crammed into a room which seemed to be too small. Swarms of photographers, every one of whom wasn't going to be the last one or the first one to move away. The thing was delayed for 20 minutes with people being told, look, if you don't step back, it's not going to happen at all. We can't guarantee the man's safety. His parents having a bit of a fight to get to the front row there. So the whole thing was very, very bizarre. And then this man, pretty well, straight from prison, 10 years in prison, up near the Finnish border, appeared before those people.
And one thing's for certain, Steve, whatever he decides to do next, the eyes of the world will be watching, won't they? Steve, many thanks for now. Steve Rosenberg there for us in Berlin.